Thank you for spending your Friday happy hour with us. I'm Tim Black. I'm a faculty member in the sociology department and the co-director of the Social Justice Institute, who's sponsoring this talk. This talk is part of our criminal justice series this fall, or what I like to think of as our criminal injustice series. We had James Foreman Jr. here last month. Bruce Western's with us today. Next month, actually very soon, on November the 6th, we're going to turn our focus to more local issues and focus on consequences of collateral sanctions. And we will have Peter Trug from the Fund for Our Economic Future, who will be speaking on collateral sanctions and consequences locally, and followed by a panel discussion, and that's on November the 6th. I think that's a Thursday. Is that right? Tuesday, November 6th. Following that in December, December 6th, I guess the thing to remember is the 6th. December the 6th, right now there is a photo exhibit over at the Martin Luther King branch of the Cleveland Public Library entitled Prison Nation, which is based on some archival photos that were found at San Quentin. So that's on display now at the Martin Luther King Library. And we will have a panel of formerly incarcerated folks who will be speaking about the reflections of their own experiences in prison and about recovery on December the 6th. So mark that on your calendars as well. But moving on to today, Bruce Western. We are so thrilled to have Bruce here. Bruce is a professor of sociology and co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University. He received his BA from the University of Queensland in Australia and his PhD from the UCLA. Western's research examines trends in American economic inequality and the growth of the U.S. penal population. These topics are joined by an interest in the shifting landscape of American poverty over the last 40 years. He is the author of Punishment and Inequality in America, published in 2007, and served as vice chair of a consensus panel of the National Academy of Sciences on the causes and consequences of high rates of incarceration in the United States. His new book, which he will be talking about today, is entitled Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison, which I should point out my class on racial inequality and mass imprisonment in America just finished reading and discussing with him right before this. What I particularly admire about Bruce's work is the rigor and sophistication of his science, which he accomplishes without shying away from crafting a political voice. Moreover, I see his work always pushing at the boundaries of social reform, in this instance criminal justice reform, without sacrificing a larger vision for political and economic transformation. Most impressive in his new book, he expands his methodological breadth to include qualitative research and analysis, and in doing so, very adeptly masters the power of sociological storytelling. Immediately following the talk, we will have, Bruce will be signing books, so we'll have a book signing back here at the table in the back, and books are being sold by A Cultural Exchange, which is a progressive independent bookstore over on Larchmere. For those of you who are not aware of them, thank you for being here. Please feel free to go over and purchase a book, and as I said, Bruce will be signing afterwards. Bruce is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Ratcliffe Fellow, and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the National Academy of Science. Please welcome Bruce Western.
Thank you so much, Tim, for the invitation to talk to you all today. I feel very distant from you right now, but the cord won't extend to the podium on the ground. So I want to move quickly through my prepared remarks and into our discussion. I'll come down to ground level, might come down to ground level for that. It is wonderful to be at CASE. It's wonderful to be here at Tim's invitation. Tim's work has inspired me for many, many years, and it's just a great thrill to be here to talk to you about it. So today what I'd like to do is talk about what has come to be called in America the problem of mass incarceration, and specifically the problem of prisoner reentry. A lot of this talk that I'm going to show you draws on my new book, Homeward. But before jumping into the research behind the book, I thought I'd first try and provide a little bit of context about how I came to write a book about men and women who were getting released from prison in Massachusetts and returning to neighbourhoods around the Boston area. So this is kind of going to be a play in 3 acts. And Act 1 sets the scene by providing a little bit of empirical context that can explain how we got to where we are today. So we think about the scale of a prison system in a country with an incarceration rate, and this is the number of people who are locked up in prisons and jails on an average day per 100,000 of the population. And if we look at Western Europe, in most Western European countries, around about 100 per 100,000 people are locked up on any given day. So that's 0.1 of 1% of the population. And of course, in the United States, the rate of incarceration is almost an order of magnitude larger. About 700 per 100,000 people are incarcerated in prisons and jails in the United States. Now, we can also think about how unusual America is in a historical context, and we have very good data that go back to the 1920s, and from the mid-1920s to the early 1970s, the incarceration rate in America was about 100 per 100,000, about what it is in Western Europe today. But in the early 1970s, the system began to grow, and it grew every year for the next 35 years. And so we're now sitting at the top of this plateau in which the rate of incarceration is 5 times higher than its historic average. So what does this mean in terms of numbers? It means that there are about 1.6 million people who are serving time for a felony offence in state or federal prison. That's not the entire penal population, because there are people who are incarcerated in local jails, and they're mostly awaiting trial or serving short sentences, and there are 730,000 people in local jails. Now, that's not the entire correctional population, because there are people under supervision in the community, and there are about 850,000 people who have served prison sentences and they've been released to the community under the supervision of a parole officer. There are about 850,000 people on parole in the United States. That's not the entire community corrections population, because there are about another 4 million people on probation who are serving suspended custodial sentences, and they're meeting with probation officers out in the community. You add it all up, it's about 7 million people. 7 million people in America are currently under some kind of correctional supervision. Now, as striking as these numbers are, that's not what is most important about incarceration in America. The most important thing about incarceration in America is its unequal distribution of the population. Everything I've shown you so far is a snapshot at a point in time. Each one of the dots on this plot is the number of people on an average day who are incarcerated. But we might also think about incarceration over the life course, and we might ask, well, what's the chances someone will ever serve time in prison at some point in their lives? And so in research with Becky Pettit at the University of Texas at Austin, we thought about a birth cohort. Think about people who are growing up in the late 1940s. And so if you're growing up in the late 1940s, you're reaching your mid-30s at the end of the 1970s. So you're growing up before the period of the American prison boom. There's a very large racial disparity in incarceration. So African Americans are about 6 or 7 times more likely to go to prison than whites. And if we look at men born in this 1945 to 49 birth cohort, if they never went to college, and that's about half of all black men in this birth cohort, about 12% of them, we estimated, are going to go to prison at some point in their lives. And if we look at high school dropouts, about 15% we estimated have prison records. Now we're interested in a statistic like this because we think incarceration may confer a whole array of disadvantages that affects you even after you've left prison. And this is telling us something about the size of the group that's at risk of those adverse life chances as a result of going to prison. So let's compare this group to another birth cohort born a generation later. So now we're thinking about men who were born in the late 1970s. And so these men are growing up through the period of the American prison boom. For African American men who never went to college, we estimate about 36% have been to prison. And this is the very deep end of the system. So this is a state or federal prison, a felony conviction, 28 months of time served at the median, sometimes very much longer than that. There are about 50,000 people in the United States who are currently serving life without parole sentences, who will never be released. By comparison to Western Europe, the number of people serving life without parole sentences, natural life sentences they call them there, is about 40. So 40 in Western Europe compared to 50,000 in the United States. If we look at African American men who never completed high school, so less than 12 years of completed schooling, about 70% we estimate have prison records. So, and all of this is happening now at a time when crime rates are historically low. Right? Crime is at its lowest level now in about 4 decades or more. And this was a change that was brought about by really a revolution in sentencing policy, a very fundamental change in criminal justice policy in which prison time became the presumptive response to a felony conviction in our criminal justice system. And that change in policy made prison time pervasive among black men with very low levels of schooling, and incarceration became more common than not. So a lot of research grew up around statistics like this, and people were trying to understand well, what are the effects of incarceration, particularly on patterns of social and economic inequality in America. And there was a lot of research on labour markets and employment, and on health and on families and on the well-being of children with incarcerated parents. It's a big, complicated literature. If you could distill all that research, I would summarise it in the following way. Mass incarceration, which is this historically high level of incarceration that's overwhelmingly socially concentrated in a very disadvantaged segment of the population. Mass incarceration criminalised a whole variety of social problems related to racial inequality and poverty. Now, some of these social problems included problems of crime and serious violence, but they also included problems of untreated addiction and mental illness and chronic joblessness and extreme housing insecurity and homelessness. The criminal justice system became the de facto response to a whole variety of social problems that were very closely related to very enduring racial inequalities and comparatively and the comparatively unusually harsh conditions of poverty in America. So we're incarcerating on an unprecedented scale. And because of the effects of incarceration on labour markets, on health, on families, incarceration itself is tending to contribute to the reproduction of poverty and inequality, and it's contributing to socioeconomic disadvantage, both over the life cycle. So as people get older, they remain trapped in poverty, trapped in segregated neighbourhoods, blocked off from the mainstream structure of opportunities in American society, and poverty and racial inequality are reproduced from generation to generation. So the inequalities that are produced by mass incarceration are extremely enduring. A lot of this research was summarised by the National Academy of Sciences in their report on the growth of incarceration in the United States. And in summarising all of this social science research, they arrived at the following recommendation. The National Academy said, given the small crime prevention effects of long prison sentences and the possibly high financial, social and human costs of incarceration, federal and state policymakers should revise current criminal justice policies to significantly reduce the rate of incarceration in the United States. And I have to say, this is an unusual type of recommendation for the National Academy of Sciences. Often a National Academy's report, the leading recommendation is more research is needed. This was not an area in which more research was needed. There was a real urgency to what we were finding in the incarceration panel, and our headline recommendation was that incarceration rates had to be reduced. As much of the contribution as this research made to our understanding of poverty and racial inequality, and I'd been doing work on this problem with large social science data sets for several decades, I was not fully satisfied with a lot of the work that I myself was doing in this area. I worried that the empirical analysis lacked realism. It wasn't realistic. I was reducing people to the demographic facts of age, race, and your level of education. This was a very thin statistical portrait of people who were tangled up in the criminal justice system. And I was getting to know people in the criminal justice system because I was beginning to teach in prison a lot as I was doing this research, and the kinds of things I was hearing about people, about their lives and so on, was not fully reflected in the work I was doing with these big quantitative data sets. The actual process of how someone goes from a prison and finds their place in a community again after incarceration, the kinds of big social science data sets I was analysing wasn't telling me very much about that social process. Were people living with family? What happened when they applied for a job? How was their health affecting them? Again, that wasn't being analysed very well in the big sort of social survey data sets that I was analysing. The social process was missing in the work that I was doing. Finally, I was worried a lot about undercoverage, and because we're talking about a group of people who are often very insecurely housed, often struggling with addiction and mental illness, they were just unlikely to appear in social surveys that drew national samples from a sampling frame consisting of all US households. Sometimes people weren't strongly attached to any one household, or they were living in several households, or they were living in a more institutional setting, like a transitional housing program or a homeless shelter. Sometimes people were street homeless, and then they would be missed entirely by a social survey that was drawing on a sampling frame of households. So I worried about the problem of undercoverage, and I felt I needed to get into the field and to observe in a very direct way what this process looked like of going from a penal institution and returning to a community after incarceration. So this is Act 2 now, the Reentry study. Because of this dissatisfaction I was feeling with a lot of the research that had been conducted, I started having a conversation with a friend of mine, Anthony Braga. Anthony was a professor at Northeastern University, and we were both going into prison to teach, and we'd take these bus rides together, and I was saying to Anthony, you know, we really got to study the re-entry process by getting out into the field and talking to people and really seeing what this experience of leaving incarceration looks like. But the big difficulty with this research is keeping track of people after they leave prison. Anthony had grown up in Boston. He knew Boston very, very well. He'd worked closely with the Boston Police Department. He said, I reckon we could keep track of everyone. We could draw a sample of people leaving state prison in Massachusetts. If they were returning to Boston, I reckon we could keep track of everyone. And this is how the Boston Reentry study was hatched. It was a collaborative project involving Anthony and myself and Rihanna Cole. Rihanna was the research director at Department of Correction in Massachusetts. The design of the study was longitudinal. We were recruiting out of Massachusetts state prisons, and there was only one criteria for eligibility for the study. You had to be returning to a neighbourhood around the Boston area. So this meant we interviewed men, we interviewed women, we interviewed people at all different ages. We're in all the different correctional facilities in the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. We're in medium security prisons, we're in pre-release centers, we're in maximum security. We talk to people in non-contact units behind plexiglass. We talk to people in disciplinary units in solitary confinement who are about to release to the street a few days later. We were interviewing people in the state psychiatric hospital, which was run by the Department of Correction, who are also returning from incarceration. We followed people over the course of a year. We interviewed people 5 times over the year, once a week before prison release, 1 week after prison release, 2 months after release, 6 months and 12 months after release. I was bringing a lens to this research really as a poverty researcher, which is more my background in many ways, and so we're interested in things like people's employment and housing and their family relationships, but we're also interested in their criminal justice contact, their involvement in crime as well. So that was the kind of data we were collecting. The data were very, very rich, and it's difficult to summarize exactly what we learned, but if I had to pull out 3 things from the research, I would highlight these 3 findings. First, and this was unexpected, I have to say. First, as we got to know people, they talked a lot to us about the different kinds of violence that they had experienced in their lives, and a lot of this violence they experienced in early childhood, and certainly the people in our sample, some of whom had perpetrated acts of serious violence, had also been seriously victimized by violence, often in early childhood. Certainly they'd witnessed a lot of violence, often in their family homes. So there was a lot of trauma in our sample that people described to us. As we got into the research, we completely redesigned our final exit interview, and we drew up a new module that tried to understand early child experiences of trauma at the final exit interview, which was a topic that we weren't sensitized to greatly going into the field. Second thing, people are in poor health. This is a sample that is dealing with very high rates of chronic and infectious disease. Some of it's related to poverty, some of it's related to exposure to violence over the life course. People's mental health is very poor. We had lots of reports of mood disorders, high rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD. About 20% of our sample reported to us diagnoses of serious mental illness. So that's things like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorders, bipolar disorders, psychoses. So people are in poor physical and mental health. We came to call this human frailty. This is a generalization of a term in demography and epidemiology. And we felt that this described a whole variety of co-occurring mental and physical problems that people are often dealing with as they come out of prison. Third thing is there is an incredibly acute level of material hardship after prison. Incomes are very, very low. Median income in our sample in the first year after prison was $6,000. $6,000 is about half of the federal poverty line for an individual living alone, and that's called a level of deep poverty in the poverty research field. There was virtually no independent housing in our sample at all. People either lived with family, so they were doubling up with family, or they were in some sort of institutional setting like a homeless shelter or a transitional housing program, or they were street homeless. So very little independent housing after prison, and very, very serious income poverty. So here's an example of exposure to trauma. Here's some data showing you the percent of our respondents who were reporting different kinds of traumas that they had experienced while they were growing up. About 60% of the sample reported to us serious drug use in the family in which they were growing up. 50% said they had been beaten by their parents. 40%, incredibly, had seen someone get killed in childhood. 40% of the sample. That wasn't always a murder. People had witnessed suicides. People had witnessed serious accidents in which people had gotten killed. About 40% of them, their parents had lost custody of them. Sometimes that meant they were in youth custody themselves. Sometimes that meant that they were in foster care. But their parents had lost legal guardianship for them. High rates of criminal victimization among family members, high rates of domestic violence, suicidality, and about 20% of the sample reported to us that they had been sexually abused as kids. So that gives you a sense of what childhood trauma looked like in the data. What about health problems, mental health problems, physical health problems? About 60% of the sample said to us that they had histories of alcoholism or drug addiction. About 50% reported diagnoses of depression. About 40% said they suffered from chronic pain. Sometimes that was from injuries. Sometimes it resulted from things like arthritis that is associated with sustained opioid use. About a quarter of the sample were heroin users. About a fifth suffered from anxiety or PTSD, and about 15% said that they had a psychotic diagnosis. So very poor physical and mental health that tended to be co-occurring. One of the interesting things about human frailty and its relationship to trauma is that those people who had been exposed to the greatest trauma in childhood were in the worst health in adulthood. So there's a strong positive relationship between childhood trauma, exposure to violence, histories of victimization on the one hand, and poor physical and mental health, which tended to cluster together on the other hand. If people reported to us that they had been abused as children, either sexually abused or beaten by their parents, they were more likely than you would expect, given their exposure to childhood trauma, to be in poor health. Our measure of frailty in adulthood here just involves counting up the number of problems that people had reported to us. Diagnoses of mental illness, different kinds of physical problems related to chronic and infectious disease and chronic pain. And you can divide the sample roughly in half. And those who were suffering from serious mental and physical problems we described as characterized by human frailty. So if you look at people's reentry experiences and you think of the frail and the non-frail, and the frail are those who are dealing with the most serious physical and mental health problems, the people who had the most serious health problems were more likely to be using opioids after prison release, in the year after prison release. If we look at their housing, housing was much more insecure. People were more likely to be street homeless, or they were more likely to be in the city's shelter system or in some sort of transitional or emergency housing program in the year after release from prison, compared to those who are in better physical and mental health. Finally, employment. People's employment improved over the year. People tended to find work in that year after incarceration. But again, those who struggled the most with poor physical and mental health had the highest rates of joblessness. So exposure to trauma in childhood associated with poor health in adulthood, associated with the most challenging experiences of reentry in the year after incarceration. Now, this kind of work, and we did a ton of this as we analysed the data from the reentry study, still looks a lot like the big data statistics that I was showing you earlier about lifetime risks of incarceration for different demographic groups. And I feel it is giving us one kind of story about what the experience of reentry looks like and who gets drawn into the criminal justice system. But it's still missing the very human stories that I was hearing increasingly as I was going into prison, and as I was hearing from the research subjects who are involved in the reentry study. So part of what I tried to do in the reentry study was to tell people stories. And what I want to do is read a very brief excerpt just to give you a flavour of how I was trying to come to grips with the stories I was hearing. from the field. And I'm going to read a short passage about a man called Peter. He was an older African-American man who participated in the study. Peter was an older black man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and an elegant bearing. He arrived early for our interview a week after his release. Waiting on the street, he was hesitant to face the crowd inside the diner in Mattapan. We began the interview by asking Peter, what's the best part of being out for him? Breathing fresh air, he said. What's the most challenging thing? Being around a bunch of people, just being in public spaces. And we ultimately came to call this the stress of transition, the social interaction on the outside immediately after incarceration could cause people a lot of anxiety, being on crowds, being on public transport, being in crowds and so on. Although he got anxious in crowds, Peter began his latest release with a flurry of activity. He came home on a Friday, and that morning he bought clothes and got a haircut. He spent time with his sister that first day and stayed over at her house. 5 other people were living in his sister's house, including her fiancé, 1 adult son, and 2 younger children. Peter worried that he was a burden on what was already a crowded family home. He could have stayed with his father, but his father drank. His brother also stayed there, and he was dealing drugs. Being at my father's wasn't a healthy situation. My sister's is the safest place for me. Peter spent his first weekend home with his 9-year-old son. They talked, did some shopping, and went to the movies. On his first Monday after getting out, he reported to probation in the morning and then visited his father in the afternoon. On Tuesday, he enrolled in food stamps and then met with his oldest son later in the day. He went to the welfare office again on Wednesday and then visited his younger son's school to introduce himself to the boys' teachers. Thursday was mental health counselling. By the end of his first week out, Peter had spent time with 2 of his 3 children, enrolled in food stamps, obtained a mass transit card and made an appointment for counselling, checked in with several shelters, visited a career centre, and the following week he would begin his job search. So this was my effort to try and get at the texture, the narrative that people were living after incarceration. In the book, I argued that the overwhelming reality facing people who have been to prison has 3 main characteristics. Poverty is one, racial inequality is another, and the third is violence. And in the policy debates about reentry and criminal justice reform, I think we're often not very good at talking about any of these things, and we're not very good at talking about them altogether. We need to get better at that. Poverty, racial inequality and violence. For liberal criminal justice reformers, the issue of violence poses a significant challenge. And I want to show a clip of Peter talking about violence and incarceration.
As a kid, I thought my father was the toughest person. I thought the only person that was fair to me was my father. When I went to prison, I found out my father was a shit. He was scared of me. I stabbed 4 people in one day. I didn't care. I didn't care.
How old are you?
19, 20.
What happened after that?
I went to the hole. I went to the hole and he sent me up the wall. And from there, it was just uphill. Nothing but violence. But I was with that. I thought that I could go to jail and just stay to myself, do my time, and get out. Nope.
Is the audio okay? Could you hear that okay? So Peter's experience, I think, shows how violence is sustained over a lifetime, and it shows how the prison itself is a source of violence in people's lives. And this raises the question for me, whether incarceration on a massive scale could ever be a successful anti-violence strategy. So if not incarceration, then what? Could we reimagine a criminal justice system that takes on the real social conditions of poverty and racial inequality and violence over the life course? If we think about reentry specifically, I think there are clearly three areas in which there are very, very acute needs. That's transitional income support. People have very, very low incomes when they come out. Healthcare, there are very serious healthcare needs, and housing. Those three things, income support, healthcare and housing, I think are the three keys to successful reentry policy. But with mass incarceration, the prison itself has become a major public policy challenge, right? We're often trying to remediate the negative effects of prison. And prison, for all their effects, create an important event, which is leaving prison. And leaving prison begins this struggle for social belonging. And so I think perhaps the key lesson of the reentry study says something very deep about the nature of incarceration. We usually think of incarceration as a deprivation of liberty, a loss of autonomy. But for the men and women who are leaving prison in Boston, they're also disconnected from intimate social bonds of family and friendship and work and community. And the fundamental justice challenge, I think, involves strengthening these bonds of family and community for victims and offenders alike in the aftermath of violence and other harm. That's our real sort of justice challenge. So I find myself sort of sliding into a policy talk here, and you know, one of the larger lessons, which is not so much a policy lesson, I suppose, is that leaving prison involves a very human process of transformation. I want to show Peter again, and he's talking about transformation in his life. And in this clip, he's talking about his son. Now, his son had a brother who was shot dead in the Boston neighborhood of Dorchester. The brother was young, was 14 years old, and Peter was driving down to New York to get a suit for his son to attend the funeral of his brother.
I was taking my son to New York, my youngest son to New York, to get on the suit to go to his brother's funeral, and my mother called me because she had found out what happened. And I cried all the way to New York. My son was in the back seat asleep, I could see him. He was gone with mental. He was gone with women. And I cried. And I asked my mama, I told my mama, I said, if I change my life, I will be taking care of this. She was like, and I was like, if I change my life, is he to take care of this? And she was like, yeah.
These acts of self-transformation from people whose agency is often compromised by trauma in childhood, by human frailty, by struggling with deep mental health and physical problems. And I could talk to you a lot more about reentry policies and programs, but at a very human level, I think we need a justice policy that welcomes and secures a place for those who have been drawn into violence, whether it's the violence of street crime or the state violence of mass incarceration. You know, this is how a community can play its role in people's personal transformation. They shouldn't have to do it on their own, which is, I think, what is currently being asked. So I want to tell one last story. And this is meant to suggest all of the possibility that lies before us. I was in Addis Ababa a few years ago, and we had this research project studying justice institutions in Ethiopia. And I was at a dinner with two Ethiopian researchers, and one of them, Mulugeta, told me about a colleague at his research institute as a German anthropologist. And one day the anthropologist was out in a remote area and he was driving through a small village, and his car tragically struck a small child and killed the child. The girl's parents ran outside to see what had happened, and a crowd quickly formed around the anthropologist, and the parents tended to the child. The anthropologist asked that the police be called, but he was told that there weren't any police there and the village dealt with matters like this by itself. So the anthropologist was told that he could go, but they would send for him in a few days. So he went back to Addis. And a week later, a message came for him that he had to return to the village. And he was told that he had to return alone. So he went to my friend Mulugeta and he asked, well, what should I do? And Mulugeta said, you have to go back to the village. So he went back, and when he got there, he was escorted to a meeting with the elders of the village. And first he was told to pay 2,500 birr, that's about $125, to the family of the dead child. And next he was ordered by the meeting to buy a goat for the family. And he purchased a goat, which was then immediately slaughtered. And the father of the dead child was called to the front of the meeting. And the anthropologist, he was already standing at the front of the room. He was told to hold out his hand. And so he held out his hand, and his wrist was bound to the wrist of the child's father with the entrails of the goat. And the village elder then announced that the anthropologist was now a member of the dead girl's family. And that was that. He was free to go. The anthropologist returned to Addis. He was very upset. He felt he hadn't properly compensated the family, nor had he been punished. And Mulugeta said, you have to understand that for the rest of your life, you're now a part of that man's family. And you have all of the obligations of a family member. You have to visit them from time to time. If they're going through problems that you might help them with, you should help them, just as a member of their own family would. And so Western ideas about punishment and retribution are radically absent in this case of customary justice in Ethiopia. And like the Ethiopian story, the problem of prisoner reentry raises the question of when does punishment end, when and how are debts extinguished, and these questions are as ethical as they are empirical. I've tried to maintain this ethical perspective in this research, and to guide politics or policy, the ethics of punishment have to confront the real lives of those that are incarcerated. And we have to test our values against the real conditions of poverty, racial inequality, and violence that surrounds mass incarceration. And I hope if we can do that, that we might imagine a better path to justice. So thank you very much.
I have two questions. One is just a curiosity, and I'll tell you why. I'm a recovered addict, and I was wondering why you separated heroin from substance abuse in the one study, and the second one, and this is probably more apropos to the ethics part. Did you run into anything in your research? The movie Brubaker in 1980 with Robert Redford kind of got into this, but the lack of any kind of thing about rehabilitation being important in the justice system. I know it's sort of like disappeared in this country in 1970s.
I pulled out opioid use because there are a whole set of other physical problems that are associated with sustained opioid use. I think it was it was an important part of our study too, because I think part of the context of our field research is the reality of an opioid crisis at the moment, and which is particularly serious in the New England area. I think it helped us to make sense of a lot of chronic health problems people were having. But I take your point, or perhaps the implication of your question, that we're having a very different conversation, policy conversation, cultural conversation about opioid use today than we had compared to the late 80s and early 90s, for example, when crack cocaine was a massive public health crisis, particularly in very disadvantaged communities of colour. And we seem to be having a public health crisis, a public health conversation today, but back then we were having a very punitive criminal justice conversation. And that point is very well taken, and it's a real point. And rehabilitation. I think you're absolutely right. The part of the context for this tremendous growth in incarceration was an abandonment of rehabilitation as a correctional philosophy, and the chief purpose, the official purpose of the system, was punishment. And a lot of programming, particularly educational programming, particularly high levels of educational programming, college programs in prisons, largely disappeared through this period that incarceration rates were growing. I think we're entering a period of reform, or at least a new kind of crime policy conversation is emerging. I think there's an understanding that very high rates of incarceration have been incredibly costly, and there's a good debate to be had about, do we do incarceration better or do we do it less? And I think I would the kind of change that I would love to see is doing incarceration radically less and improving community support on the outside. That's where how I would like to see our public investment changed.
Thank you for such a wonderfully informative talk. I had a question about offenses prior to being released. If there were any differences contingent on what their conviction was based on. So if they were convicted on something like arrested for possession of drugs versus a murder, was there any differences? And then my second question had to do with resilience. So you talk about frailty, and I feel like there has to also be a story about resilience in terms of people who might have had successful outcomes. I guess a related question is, how many of the people who you all studied recidivated after that first year?
So about a third of the sample returned to custody over the 1 year follow-up people, and we went back into prison or jail, wherever they were at, to interview them and find out what happened. And we're talking about this with Tim's students this afternoon, I think, and it really goes to this issue of resilience and frailty. The way I think about it is twofold, and I'm not sure if this is resilience. I think people are sometimes able to adopt a whole variety of coping strategies to deal with the challenging problems of being broke, not being properly housed, dealing with your health problems immediately after incarceration, and people would try and adapt in all sorts of different ways, in ways oftentimes in which they're avoiding the police, they're avoiding contact, and sometimes this wasn't always really positive. They're faced with an array of bad choices. So if probation was drug testing at their sober house, maybe they would spend time on the street until they felt they were clean enough that they could return to their sober house program, and if they were drug tested, they'd be able to pass it okay. So I felt I would think about that sort of thing more as a coping strategy rather than resilience. I think, this process of succeeding in the year after incarceration, and this is, I think, what I took from the short video clip with Peter. It's very agentic. You have to be very planful, very energetic in the process of staying out, getting a job, maintaining your health regimen, getting enrolled in food stamps, and so on. And I think we often think, or the criminologists often think of recidivism as a behavioural failure, returning to crime. And if you only didn't return to crime, then you could successfully complete that year after incarceration. I felt what we were seeing is people really had to be actively involved in the project of staying out in order to do it successfully. And sometimes that involved having a history of prior reentries, prior incarcerations, and so you became practiced. You know where to get the services, which programs worked and which didn't, and so on. And so it was a very agentic process of staying out. And maybe that's what resilience looks like, being able to sort of summon up that agency, that capacity for planfulness and the energy that's required to do all of that. Charges. There were real patterns in charges. I don't think the things that people were charged for were closely related to their outcomes afterwards, but we definitely saw patterns. Most of the drug offences were concentrated among younger African American men. Most of the firearms charges were concentrated among younger African American men. None of the women we interviewed were convicted of violence. They were mostly drug-related offences. So we saw that sort of demographic pattern. I think things like murder were important to the extent that they resulted in really long sentences. And that affected the experience of reentry afterwards, because you'd been institutionalised for a long period of time and you had a lot of really significant adjustments to make as you returned to community. And that's the sense in which charge was important.
Thank you. I would just like to thank you for the work that you and your colleagues have provided us, because me personally, everything in there, just being, I'm 56 and a woman of color, I've experienced all of it. And it's just sad that we live in America, and with this information and being researched, and you've proven it, but yet we have a system that is constantly doing things wrong, and we know it's wrong. And from what I see, it's now going over into our education system. And so my question is, how do we, as citizens, what do we do to really, because I'm tired of talking about it, I'm tired of hearing it, because just as a human and knowing my life is for a purpose and one day it's going to end and I'm going to have to give an account for it, what do we do to change it?
That is the $64,000 question. And I think there's a political opening now. I think there is the beginnings of a political discussion. So we saw in the 2016 election the Democratic debates during the primaries. Every debate, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were talking about criminal justice policy and talking about the over-policing of disadvantaged communities and the problems of mass incarceration. I feel that is really new and important. So these issues are really seeping into our politics. So I think we have to be very active with our elected officials on this issue. The issue is on the horizon. And we have to indicate to them that this is an issue that we care about, and they have to be responsive to it. At a more general level, I think Brian Stevenson talks a lot about gaining proximity. We have to gain proximity to this problem, and so I think for students in the audience, this may mean volunteering with direct service providers or working with advocacy organisations. And I know there's a real criminal justice reform community here in Cleveland, and people can plug into those communities and get involved in that work. I think it's really important to do that, and then take that experience home to the dinner table and have that conversation with family members and put this issue front and center as a family conversation. At a more general level, I think the system grew so much out of dehumanization and vilifying people and demonizing people, and there's a larger cultural project here, a project of humanization and talking about people in all of their complexity. And we made monsters of people. We turned people into monsters. And I think part of what we have to do is understand, a little bit about the monsters inside of us as a way of building sort of real empathy in order to have a much more human conversation. So at the most general cultural level, I think that's one of our biggest challenges.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the extensive exposure to violence and trauma that some of your respondents mentioned, and if upon their reflection of that, if they expressed how they felt that was impacting their lives, or if they were desensitized to it.
I found this an extraordinarily difficult area as a researcher, and I think we got into it just by hearing people talk about violence in their lives. As we got to know them, they talked more and more about this over the course of the year that we got to know people. Inside our research team, we began to research this more actively. We weren't incredibly informed. We didn't have a lot of background in what exposure to violence and trauma in childhood might mean for human development, but there's a very significant scientific literature there that we tried to learn about, and we tried to design an instrument to really measure it systematically. It was difficult because A lot of the research is on general population data sets, and we felt that the exposure to violence and trauma in our sample was much more extreme than you would see in the general population, so we couldn't simply lift survey items or something like that, and so we tried to devise new kinds of items to measure it. I think I think our data in this area is very mixed. I think some people spoke more readily about their experiences than others. We were very conscious of re-traumatizing people in the conversations we would have, and we didn't want to push too hard. Consent in this whole area is very sensitive, and so I feel we're just beginning to gain an understanding of the true impact of exposure to trauma, and the implications are very deep and wide-ranging. Partly it means we need to be much less punitive if we take seriously the harms that victims have suffered, and the people who have often hurt other people very seriously themselves have serious histories of victimization. So if we're going to take victims seriously, then we have to take that victimization seriously as well. I think programming should be affected. There's a lot of talk now about trauma-informed programming. I think we have a lot to learn there, actually. Lip service is paid to that idea, but what it really means is pretty complicated, actually. So I feel that is just the start of a much larger project. If there are students in the market for research questions, I think that one is incredibly important.
Okay, 2 questions. I wasn't sure if you said the entrails of the goat or the girl. The goat. The goat. Okay, it was your accent. I couldn't quite get it. Okay, and also you talked about the issues that those recently released after incarceration had with reentry. How have you found that affects their families and their friends, support systems? Because I would be in that, that category.
The family effects are huge, I think. So when people were living in private households, and that was about half of the sample, they were doubling up with family, and often the households were pretty crowded to begin with, and now here's a 35, 40-year-old man or a woman returning from incarceration with all of those challenges, and typically the support that we saw in the data is being provided by older women in the lives of the men and women we were interviewing. So it's mothers, grandmothers, older sisters, aunts that are doing a massive amount of caring work. I think the research has not focused on the amount of family support provided by older women in communities that are really deeply impacted by incarceration. The researchers have focused on romantic partners and kids mostly, but the real sources of family support were older women. As a public policy matter, we have to figure out how to support those women, I think, because they're doing so much caring work. For the older people that we were interviewing, who had been to prison in many cases, many times, they're really struggling with very persistent problems of addiction and mental illness. Oftentimes they had really burned their bridges with family, and they were very socially isolated. So for men in their 50s, they had the weakest family connections, and the stress over decades had just proved too much. I was saying to Tim and his class before this talk, I couldn't understand all of the caring work done by the mothers that we spoke to in the study in any other terms than maternal love. That was the only way I could explain the amount of support and they were providing to their formerly incarcerated sons and daughters who were coming out.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Winters. I had a revelation. I saw a TV clip. I don't even have TV, so I must have been at a friend's house. And it was some women in prison in Germany, and they're allowed to be called by their own name. They're allowed to wear their own clothes. And it suddenly struck me as I watched this for about a minute and a half, and that's all I watched. I don't even know what program it was. What would our society look like if we treated people in prison like a person? Because here we have all this punitive punishing, and then we treat you like an animal. You're a number. You're just a blur of blue or gray or whatever you have to wear, and then you go to isolation, and then it's time for you to come out, and we suddenly expect people to behave like a person when they haven't been treated like a person. So it's not a question for you, Mr. Winters, to answer, but what would it take for us to treat people incarcerated like a person, like with some basics, like use their name. Let them be a person. Don't put them in isolated holding cells. I know that I don't have an answer. This is collectively a rhetorical question for all of us to think about. I did come into proximity with trauma. I volunteer at a support group. It's not per se for drugs only, but it's for hurts, habits, or hang-ups. So we have people who are sexually abused as young kids. We have people who have suffered through violence or witnessed it as a young person. And this stuff takes long time and work to unravel. And we can't treat someone like an animal and then expect them to just pop out, go get a job, go get a house, go get an address, go do for yourself. That's just my sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much. The one tiny thing I would say, I think the fundamental challenge of justice reform is fundamentally the challenge of humanisation. I think that is it, and I think you said it powerfully.
Okay, hi. I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a comment because I've been in so many different meetings for different reasons all over our community, and I find different groups everywhere kind of talking about the same thing, looking for the same solutions, and I just keep saying, could you just let me bring you all together? So I just want you all to know that right now from 6 to 8 tonight at 68th and Euclid at the new tech building, there is a Fix 216 criminal justice reform, and it goes into tomorrow from 10 to 5, and it's about community coming in and actually creating solutions. And there are other things, but you'll probably meet some people there for any of you that can come down.
Ma'am, to what you said about that program in Germany, that's a restorative justice model that they apply over there that started in New Zealand, where part of that is the humanization of the offenders, but also giving more voice to the victims in the process and taking a community approach, one that promotes healing and is healing-centered. Basically, the problem over here is that, it's about money. And it's about the harvesting of labor, point blank. To your point that was said about the problems that a lot of reentrants suffer. What we've learned is that one is called learned helplessness. If I'm in a controlled environment, and for many, many years I'm told what to do, when to do, and how to do it, and my movement is controlled, And then I get out and I go from a do this, do that, to a don't do this, don't do drugs, don't associate with other known felons and the like, and by the way, get a job and assimilate or re-assimilate. I'm getting bombarded with a lot of stimuli. I'm like a creature let off a leash. What do I do? Which way do I go? And then with a lot of the men who have grew up in them facilities under that, and women, their sense of self and identity is attached to the things they survived in there. If you, for instance, are an older grand, meaning you've been locked up 15 years, 20 years, and you still standing erect, there's a certain respect afforded to you. But when you get out to a society that kind of recognizes you not, to a younger generation that is traumatized and is moved by their traumas, and you come trying to speak to them or expect some type of respect from them, and they know you not, and they have father issues, there's no love. There's no place. You can't find yourself in place and time in this society. So it becomes hard. I sit on a committee called the Stance Committee. And in my position in community relations, it was important for us to sit on this committee because we have 90 men projected to come back to the city of Cleveland from Lucasville, from Toledo, which is a maximum security, and from OSP. And what they have found in the reentrants coming from them institutions in the years prior, they go right back. And so we sitting on this committee and they're trying to figure out what it is, and it's like those prisons does not support reentry. They're security and control. And it was interesting that you have these professionals sitting on there that didn't know that, and you have somebody like me who did almost 20 years in the penitentiary have to sit there and tell them that. You know, so 50% of solving a problem is how it's framed. So in closing on that, this trauma-informed care is super important. And this is the forefront of dealing with this situation now, because we have children who are traumatized. This is structural violence, the laws, the policies, practices, procedures that systematically criminalizes the poor and block from access to opportunities, and then the toxic environments that it creates, which generate a lot of this, not to mention the lead poisoning and the other things. Framing is very important because this is a starting point for us to properly frame the problem and to understand the medical approach with the trauma-informed care that's needed, where the people who suffer from this, the hurt people who begin to hurt people, we deal with them like human beings, and we don't address a symptom and lock them away. We understand environments that create this and address it on a systemic level and on a human being level.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That was right on.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. I want to remind you that our next event will be on November 6th, the next event addressing criminal injustice issues. And I especially want to thank Bruce Western for being here this evening.